Shoutouts this week to some fans of World War II history, Ollie from Chicago, Mickey from St. Louis, and a special thank you to Jan from Phoenix, who recommended the idea we'll be talking about today. Today's topic is the man with a plan, also known as George Catlett Marshall, who did more with his time on Earth than most. While his accomplishments are many, his legacy is the Marshall Plan and how it shaped the world in which we live today. If you have any thoughts or feedback, send it to me through email at tim@shapingopinion.com. If it's easier for you, get in touch with me on Twitter or Instagram @shapingopinion. If you want, we can give you a shout out. And as always, thank you for being a listener of the Shaping Opinion podcast. You're the reason we do this. This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. Rachel, George Marshall turned down book offers. He avoided personal publicity and he appeared to be a private individual. Was this his personality or was there a strategic reason for it?
To some degree, it was his personality. First of all, he was not... He was a person who did not cash in on what was to become his fame. He was definitely a well-known public figure, but he felt that a professional demeanor was an important thing to him. Having studied him behind the scenes, literally in his home, he was a very warm and cordial person, a very friendly person, but in his public persona, he felt that there was a demeanor that was important, that he needed to have a certain demeanor of confidence, for example, especially when he was facing very complex problems. And he simply did not need to have fame. He became famous. He became a famous public figure. He was on the cover of Time. He was Time Man of the Year. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. He did all of these things. But that part of it truly was not a part of his ambition. And he went to VMI, and at VMI there was that idea of duty above personal preference, and his sense of duty was truly sincere and honest.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Rachel Yarnell Thompson. She's an author and the Marshall historian at the George C. Marshall International Center in Leesburg, Virginia. We'll talk with Rachel about the man who was one of the key architects of the Allied victory in World War II and his role in shaping the world after the war, and largely as we know it today. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we'll talk with Rachel about George Marshall's plan, best known as the Marshall Plan, to rebuild Europe after the devastation of World War II. George C. Marshall was named the Army Chief of Staff in Washington on the day that Nazi tanks rolled through Poland on their way to near complete domination of Eastern and Western Europe. He was the first five-star general in American history. From that day forward, he transformed the American military into a level of power never before seen. He oversaw the countries and the Allies' military strategy that led to unconditional victories in Europe and in the Pacific. In addition to Europe and the Pacific, he oversaw military operations in China and in the Mediterranean. He had the respect of world leaders that included President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, and of course throughout all of the armed services. He was credited with finding the generals who would win the war, including Dwight D. Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and George Patton. He was one of the architects of the D-Day invasion and was set to command the invasion of Normandy when FDR decided to keep General Marshall in Washington. FDR said to his general, quote, "I didn't feel that I could sleep at ease if you were out of Washington," end quote. George Marshall's accomplishments are many. Once the war ended, he retired from the military, and the next day he was called upon by President Harry Truman to address China's civil war as the president's special envoy. President Truman tapped George Marshall to serve as his Secretary of State, dealing with the Berlin blockade, and then to develop and implement the European Recovery Program, better known as the Marshall Plan. Along the way, George Marshall would become President of the American Red Cross and President Truman's Secretary of Defense during the Korean War, and he earned the Nobel Peace Prize. George Marshall was a study in contrasts. He was the commander of the most powerful military in the world, yet he was seen as a man of quiet, even humble confidence in his own ideas. He operated in a highly political environment with the world's leading politicians, yet he refused to become political. Often when he was asked of his own party affiliation, he would say, "I'm an Episcopalian." In the process, he won the respect, admiration, and trust of both Democrat and Republican leaders. Rachel Yarnell Thompson is the author of the biography, Marshall, a Statesman Shaped in the Crucible of War.
Well, here's the thing. There was this experience of his younger career that really helped him in terms of the role that he would have, let's say in World War II. At the end of World War I, he was aide to General Pershing, and he worked with Pershing to develop the testimony for a new Army reorganization bill. Pershing had to testify before the Congress. Pershing worked with the president. Marshall was at 40 years old, right in the heart of the action in terms of how a government worked, the federal government. He did not always find that easy. In fact, he said, "God bless democracy, I believe in it, but I suffer from it greatly." And yet, he sort of found how to deal with that because of those experiences at the end of World War I. And perhaps those skills catapulted him into the role that he had in World War II, which was to be the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. And then, because he could navigate that boundary between military power and civilian power, he was very effective at doing that. And of course, he served President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a person who drew a lot of political fire. And yet, Marshall knew how to navigate that boundary between what the military needed and what the realities of a democratic government were, even when he was serving a president that was enormously powerful, charismatic, and highly opinionated about what ought to be done.
You summed up this essence pretty well, but just for anyone that may not be familiar with George Marshall, he was born in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, December 31st, 1880. It was described in various books and your own. He came from a middle-class family. His family had old Virginia ties. He was a distant relative of Chief Justice John Marshall from the Supreme Court. And as you mentioned, he graduated from VMI in 1901. He received his commission as a second lieutenant in infantry in 1902. And then in the years after the Spanish-American War, he served with the United States overseas in positions that increased in rank and responsibility. A lot of those positions that he had were sort of aide-de-camp. He wasn't out in the battlefield. And that was one of my other questions that I wondered ever since I first learned about the career of George Marshall, and that is, did he ever regret not having a lot of combat experience on the front lines? He spent so much time masterminding some very good plans. Mm-hmm. But did he ever regret not being on the front lines?
He struggled with that all the time, actually. He wanted to lead men. And because he very early developed these skills as a person who was a planner, a person who could see the strategic picture, a person who could see the whole of the problem, that various people, let's say in World War I would be a good example, tapped him to do this kind of staff work. One of the things that he did was to basically plan the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which was an enormous operation that involved moving French troops out and American troops in, all in the dark of night. Extremely complex operation, which for all practical purposes, he planned that attack and that operation that eventually led to, finally, the victory in World War I. And there's a point where he asks to be put with troops. And essentially the commanding officer tells him, in essence, I can't spare you. So later on, in World War II, Franklin Roosevelt sincerely wanted to make him the Supreme Allied Commander of the Normandy invasion. And he said that. He said...
Well, he was a key planner in the invasion. He was one of the architects of it.
He definitely was He fought for that cross-channel invasion, and he worked with Winston Churchill, who had a very different strategic view. And it's a very complex and complicated evolution of that cross-channel invasion. Winston Churchill favored something totally different, and Winston Churchill was fearful about cross-channel invasions. You know, there was the memory of Dunkirk. But he had everything to do with the Normandy invasion. So FDR was willing to give him that command. But as soon as the buzz went out that Marshall was being considered to be the Supreme Allied Commander of the Normandy invasion, all of the newspaper articles began to accumulate. Admiral King weighed in. All kinds of other officers weighed in and said there is nobody that can do what Marshall is able to do in Washington. But Roosevelt was willing to give him that. He asked him, what would you have me do? He asked him directly. Even after all of this chatter that said it's going to be a bad idea for you to take Marshall out of Washington. And essentially Marshall said, I would not presume to know what my service to this country should be. I want you to use me in whatever way you think will be effective.
That's such a soldier's mentality because the president is the commander-in-chief. So no matter how high up you are in the military, you still answer to the commander-in-chief, and he maintained his soldier's posture that whole way.
That's true, and I also want to emphasize that one of the things he understood was that the president was the commander-in-chief and that he served that president. In fact, he told Roosevelt, in the light of the casualties that are to be expected, what I want is immaterial and irrelevant. I want you to use me in whatever way is best. And that also comes out of that VMI background that said duty above personal preference. And did he personally prefer to stay in Washington instead of becoming the Supreme Allied Commander? That's a tough one because Eisenhower had been at work for a very long time. Others had been at work to develop that invasion. But in his heart of hearts, it would have been terribly tempting for him. But he set that aside, if that did tempt him, in favor of service to his country.
Well, let's go back to something you said, because there's a thread. There's definitely a thread in his career that we're talking around at this point, but I want to ask you about. So let's go back to World War I, because a lot of people don't know the history of World War I, but the United States got into the World War late, very late, near the end of the war. And it wasn't the same. It wasn't just a prequel to World War II. There were a lot of different dynamics for both wars, but the United States entered the war late. And as you mentioned, there was the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and that really helped end the war. So just like in World War II, where the D-Day invasion was sort of the beginning of the end, a long end, but still the beginning of that end in World War II, World War I, the Meuse-Argonne offensive was the same sort of thing. It had a decisive impact on that war. So you had George Marshall, a strategist, devising the Meuse-Argonne offensive as part of a team. And then 20-some years later, he's devising the Normandy invasion. He, as an individual, played a critical role in the strategies of two world wars that both worked out great for American history and world history. So we see a thread here, and we also see the thread that you're talking about, that the leaders don't want him outside of Washington, because here's someone that not only knew military strategy, but he knew how to make Washington work. And how many people can do that? So what was his talent when it comes to keeping him in Washington? What did he know, and what could he do that other generals couldn't do?
It's an excellent question, and I do not know where he got that. It was almost a gift, like an inborn gift, this kind of globalized thinking that he seemed to be able to do. He was a young officer in World War I. He was not the general of World War II, of planning a mega offensive around his whole army, and yet, again, these generals, these important officers of World War I, recognized that he had this kind of conceptual gift to see how army movements would advance over time and place and distance. People often ask me that, and I consider it almost a talent. Now, he applied that talent. As he moved through his career, he began to see the whole picture because of the experiences that he had. And so therefore that strengthened that gift. One of the things I like to say about the fact that he had duty with Pershing at the end of World War I is that he also commanded Civilian Conservation Corps units during the 30s. So therefore, he saw how everything worked at the top in Washington, with the Congress, with the president, with politicians. And then he's working with these young men, and he knows good and well, if there's another war, these are the young men that are going to serve. And he was really impressed with the CCC concept, which was FDR's favorite New Deal program, because he was amazed at how quickly these young men developed when they had, as they said in the Army, 3 hots and a cot, and got some education, some classes, some good dental work. And so therefore, he had these experiences that helped him kind of see how things work from the top and how things work from the ground up. And so there's a very holistic set of learning there that's just based coincidentally almost on his experiences.
Well, his life experience in between those wars, as you mentioned, helped him because he's the one who's credited for taking a country that went from a peace posture and really not a superpower, not in the way we see it today. Oh. And he turned that military into a machine. Mm-hmm. And he did it not only through himself, but he surrounded himself with good people. And they said that he's had an eye for talent. He was the one that people credit for discovering the real potential in Dwight Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and George Patton, all 3 of those key generals who they in themselves have had books written about them and stories, and they've made history. And it's almost ironic because he's the one who discovered them and helped them achieve all the success they had. And he may be the lesser known of all of those people mentioned, and some of the other people that he worked with in civilian life too. So World War II is where he became a 5-star general. We know the history of World War II, that America and the Allies won the war. And after the war, George Marshall's looking at a different career now. He's looking at retiring from the military and taking a slower pace. But it wasn't long after the war that he was named Secretary of State by President Truman. Why did Harry Truman ask George Marshall to be his Secretary of State?
One of the things to remember about Truman is that he admired Marshall immensely. He admired his integrity and his talents, as have been demonstrated in World War II. And he had confidence in him, so much so that Marshall had barely retired when Truman sent him to China to try to negotiate a truce between the warring forces of Mao and Chiang. So Truman truly believed in him, and he felt that Marshall's experiences during World War II, he's an Army man, and often that's a very narrow channel of operation, but that had not been the case for Marshall. Consider that when he's trying to get his strategic view across, and his strategic view also represents the War Plans Division, he's dealing with the likes of Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt himself, who had some very strong opinions about how things should go, Chiang Kai-shek, and let's say Stalin, just for starters. And we could also mention Charles de Gaulle, which is another aspect of the settlements that needed to be made among those really powerful people. And the way he conducted himself through those conferences, which were mind-numbing in their complexity, as they sorted out, okay, whose view will win here, if you will? Will it be Winston Churchill and the Imperial General Staff? Will it be the U.S. War Plans Division with Marshall leading it? How will it all be resolved? And what shall we do about our position of America, Germany, defeat Germany first, defeat Hitler first, but we have prisoners on Bataan. We have MacArthur chomping at the bit to get the help that he needs to win the war in the Pacific, and the American people are thinking to themselves, wait a minute, I think it was Pearl Harbor that got bombed. So Marshall has the ability to keep the emotional stamina, if you will, to sort of keep this whole ball of wax in mind and to tread carefully, make course corrections, but make his way through these powerful figures who sometimes have very different ideas about how the task should be done. And so Truman is an observer of all of that. And he feels very confident that Marshall's skills go way beyond the channel of a mere general.
You mentioned some names there, and it made me wonder. It's one thing to know that your boss likes your work, FDR liked his work, or your allies liked your work, like Winston Churchill. What did Stalin think of George Marshall?
Well, Stalin got along very well with George Marshall, and there was a very good reason for it. The Russians were taking an enormous beating in the East. Eventually, they were able to push the Germans out of the Soviet Union, but Stalin is working very hard to get the Allies to agree to open a second front in Europe. Now, there are some good reasons that didn't happen in 42 and 43, and maybe Marshall's idea that it could happen then was premature. But the fact is that Marshall was always saying the way we defeat Germany is to defeat the mass of the German army on European soil. So he was always in favor of going back onto the continent. And by favoring that, he was favoring Stalin, who felt that they needed relief. So in this huge set-to between Roosevelt and Winston Churchill and Marshall as well about the North African campaign, what became Operation Torch, Stalin is seeing that as a diversion away from anything that's going to relieve the pressure of the Eastern Front. Now, later on, when we get into the Marshall Plan story, his view of Marshall and Marshall's view of him changes quite a bit.
The Marshall Plan, you mentioned it, and we do want to talk about that because I think the name of this podcast is Shaping Opinion, and people today see the world a certain way. And what many people may not realize is that the way we see the world today oftentimes can be traced right back to the Marshall Plan. Because after World War II, the world could have been an entirely different place had it not been for the Marshall Plan. So I'm going to summarize some things, and then I definitely wanted to ask you about them. Harry Truman named George Marshall his Secretary of State. One of his first orders of business was to rebuild Europe after the war, but there were some strategic reasons for that. Europe was devastated by the war. Millions had been killed or wounded. The industrial centers of England, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Belgium, and other countries, they were all devastated. Europe was on the brink of famine because agriculture had been disrupted by the war, and infrastructure, transportation was in ruins, transportation and public works. So Europe had to be rebuilt. And from a political standpoint, there was this void that was created, and it had to be filled by what America felt was a good force, a democratic force. These people were saved in Europe from a democratic America, a free country, freedom in the West. Those were all the values that we valued. And there was yet this ever-present threat of communism from China but mainly from Russia and Europe. So there was this threat, and there was this concern that the Soviet Union would try to fill that void through its own condign measures, through its own forceful measures. So the United States' approach was we're going to try to fill that void through peaceful measures, and that's where the Marshall Plan came in. Can you describe a little bit more about the strategic thinking behind the Marshall Plan?
Well, this is exactly what had to be done. There had to be economic recovery of those European countries. After World War II, and the Marshall Plan, the legislation that opened up the Marshall Plan came in 1948. But the effort to get that legislation through the Congress began with Marshall's speech at Harvard on June 5th, 1947, where he laid out the basic concepts of that plan. A lot of people think, well, the Marshall Plan was just great because it gave all of this aid to these European countries. But the fact is that the motive behind the Marshall Plan was very different than that. There were organizations like UNRWA, for example, a UN organization with lots of volunteer agencies attached to it that had given anywhere from $4 billion to $10 billion in just direct aid, food and clothing and shelter. But the problem was this lack of spiritual vigor that had been brought about by the destruction and the horrors of war. So the idea behind the Marshall Plan was to offer friendly aid so that these countries began to recover economically. It's one thing for somebody to give you a loaf of bread, but it's another thing to be able to buy a loaf of bread. So Marshall and the planners who worked with him at the State Department understood that there has to be a catalytic agent that jumpstarts these economies. These countries that were a part of the Marshall Plan, many of them, most of them were industrial countries. They had had very vigorous economies, but guess what? They had had 2 world wars, 20 years apart, devastating wars. And like other countries, like the United States, those countries had also suffered economic depression. So the idea was to, first of all, encourage them or say, if you want the friendly aid of the United States, you're going to need to work together. So there was a great emphasis on something that was regional and multinational. That was very different than the unilateral kind of approaches, nationalistic approaches that had brought to power people like Hitler and Mussolini. The idea was that if you want this friendly aid, you must work together and you must take the responsibility for saying what it is that you need to help you recover economically. And it would begin to stir economic normalcy. Marshall said, even in his retirement speech in November of 1945, he said, the people of Europe are not particularly interested in democratic institutions or peace treaties. they're worried more about where their next mouthful of food is going to come from and where they will get warmth in the night and how they will get back to the homes that have been destroyed in this war. So the idea was to build economic health through an infusion of aid.
And it wasn't just financial aid. I want to come back to that thought in a second because there's something else you used, and what I'm going to ask you about is a term called the dollar gap that you had mentioned. But before that, I want to provide a little bit of background on the Marshall Plan. The United States was the only major power in the world that was not physically damaged by that war and by World War I. And as I had mentioned, Harry Truman named George Marshall to be his Secretary of State. And as part of his Secretary of State was this rebuilding of Europe. That was a big part of it. So in a few months after George Marshall became Secretary of State, and I mentioned he was surrounded by some good people, and some of those people were George Kennan, William Clayton, and others. And there were many other people from the private sector that were involved. They created the Committee for Economic Development. And all of these people got together and they tried to really put the best minds together to see what would it take to help Europe stand on its own 2 feet. And a big part of that was trade and commerce. Well, how not only can the United States provide aid, just aid, but how can the United States provide a market for goods and services that would be sold from Europe to the United States and vice versa? So that was sort of the idea that you just mentioned, that there was this theory that if we made Europe a stronger economy and the world would become a better place, and an offshoot of that would be that it would free trade and also democratic societies would prosper. All of those things were going on. So I wanted to ask you about the dollar gap. What was the dollar gap that you had mentioned?
Well, part of the problem with these countries getting back on their feet economically was that because of the disruptions of war, factories had been demolished, industry had been greatly reduced. Some farmers, because of bombing and other factors, the fact that the farmers went to war, had interrupted crop production and that kind of thing. So virtually everything that those European countries needed, they had to get from somewhere else, even the United States. But that drained out all of their local currencies. So even though it's a complex concept, and even though it's difficult to explain, the fact is that the goods that were purchased by the United States government to help those Europeans were paid for with U.S. tax dollars. So a simple example would be a tractor, let's say, that, American Harvester tractor was being purchased by the United States government through taxpayer dollars. And that tractor was going to go, let's say, to France. Now, that French farmer, we want normal market activity. So what needs to happen is, even though that tractor comes to that French government in some way, that French farmer needs to buy it in francs, let's say. Even if the price is artificially low, even if he has to get a loan in order to purchase it. Because when normal market activity resumes, somebody doesn't give you a tractor, you buy a tractor. Those francs go into the French government as a counterpart fund. The French government then has that money to determine how it will repair its infrastructure, fix the bridges, the railroads, all of the things that have been destroyed as a part of war, whether it's a hydroelectric power plant in Austria that needs to be completed, that was begun under Hitler and was sitting idle, or whether or not the ski industry in Austria needed a boon. These countries, based on their own individual needs, made the case for what they needed. And this was a key thing about the Marshall Plan. As the United States, we're always the fix-it-up chappy. So often we say, okay, this is what we're going to give you, and this is what we want you to do. That was not the case in the case of the Marshall Plan. Those countries, based on their own needs, took those counterpart funds and invested them into that country's infrastructure. The whole goal was economic prosperity. One of the problems of the United States was that we always typically bring our soldiers home when a war is over. We were not going to have soldiers standing on street corners in these countries, rifles ready to protect these countries. What had to happen was that these countries had to recover economically so that they would be amenable to democratic institutions, and so in the end, they would be capitalist market economies and democracies. But that idea of the counterpart fund, which kept the local money in that country, was what allowed those countries ultimately to recover.
You mentioned how complex it was, and I think you very clearly explained some of the economic concepts behind the plan, and it is a very complex idea. Even to conceive that beforehand and know that it's going to work ahead of time, though no one else has ever quite tried that. So it was an experiment. On June 5th, 1947, George Marshall spoke to the graduating class at Harvard University, and that's a key date when it comes to post-war history and the history of the Marshall Plan, because, and I read the background on the nature of his speech. It almost reminded me of the Gettysburg Address, because he wasn't supposed to be the keynote speaker, and he was mostly concerned with making an appearance and saying a few obligatory remarks. But the speech he gave actually became the Marshall Plan. He talked about the potential for communist expansion into Europe to fill the void created by the rapid deterioration of those European economies. Especially, this is after the winter of 1946 and 47.
This is the business of the Europeans. The initiative, I think, must come from Europe. The role of this country should consist of friendly aid in the drafting of the European program and of later support of such a program, so far as it may be practical for us to do so. The program should be a joint one, agreed to by a number, if not all, European nations. An essential part of any successful action on the part of the United States is an understanding on the part of the people of America of the character of the problem and the remedies to be applied. Political passion and prejudice should have no part. With foresight and a willingness on the part of our people to face up to the vast responsibilities which history has clearly placed upon our country, the difficulties I have outlined can and will be overcome.
It was called the European Recovery Program, and Dr. Larry Bland, who was a Marshall scholar until his death about 8 years ago, one of the things that he said is Marshall did not like the idea of attaching a personal name to a program, because any program was the product of many minds and many efforts. But the newspapers began to talk about Marshall's Plan, and that morphed into the Marshall Plan. And eventually that was simpler than saying ERP or European Recovery Program. His speech at Harvard was very deliberate, though, because he wanted to announce the key concepts of this plan. Imagine that speech took 11 minutes. And in it, he basically lays out the key concepts, that we are going to provide friendly aid to these countries that have suffered from poverty and chaos. He names no countries, just conditions. The initiative has to come from them. In order to receive this friendly aid, they have to work together. In many ways, he lays out those basic principles in a setting that most people will ignore. You know, he's talking really to the Alumni Association at Harvard, not even the commencement. So it's a very low-key setting that he thinks will be better than putting it out on a political stage by giving it in Washington, for example. And he thought the European countries would be appropriately motivated to hear it, and they did, instantly almost, you see. So the thing to keep in mind is that Marshall tells this, in this speech, he says, what we're offering is friendly aid, but it has to be a cure and not a palliative. It has to be something systemic. And it has to invite these countries, if they're interested in receiving this aid, to work together. And that is just crucial to what happened. And that is what led to European economic integration, is that single thing that said they will work together to do this. It's remarkable, really.
For you to say that, and for someone to just think, well, what does she mean by European integration? The EU.
An embryo of the EU, if you will. And I really believe that was the beginning of it. And imagine this. These countries, Germany was going to be a part of this plan. France next door was not real happy about it. But just imagine this. He gave that speech on the 5th of June. At the early September, they sent a 700-page proposal to the United States Congress. We can hardly get a street light approved in 3 months in our town. And yet those leaders, those foreign ministers, they came together in Paris, and they knew that they had to work together if anybody was going to get anything out of it. And they did it. It's really quite amazing. Now, I'm not saying that it was an easy thing. In fact, sometimes it was downright ugly. And there was always the question of what are we going to do about Germany? And especially among the French, as you can imagine. But by golly, they did it.
16 nations were a part of that. West Germany was a part of the program in the end. And as you said, that was... When you think about it, you're just, you can even count it in months since the end of World War II. But it was just years after World War II had devastated Europe. And here they were, 16 nations, including West Germany, their former foe, taking part in a program to create a unified continent, a unified Europe for the most part. There was Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and that created the Iron Curtain. But what would you say at that point then? Now, there was this big decision. You had Europe coming together to get this aid and to work together because it wasn't just free money. And yet you had the Soviet Union deciding not to be a part of this. And by proxy, certain satellite countries around the Soviet Union that were not permitted to be a part of it, including East Germany. And then we had the whole problem with the divided Germany, and it was a lot of it was by design. But we had all of that. How did George Marshall deal with that, the Soviet resistance to his plan?
One of the things that Marshall did that was crucial as the Secretary of State is that he created something called the Policy Planning Staff, which still exists today at the State Department, because Marshall said you can't plan and operate at the same time. So he created this think tank, if you will, and he made the brilliant George Kennan the head of that. And the first policy planning staff paper was the recommendations for the Marshall Plan. The question came up and was talked about at great length. What about the Soviet Union? When Marshall was going to give his speech, when they were getting ready to actually launch this program, what about the Soviet Union? And Kennan said, play it straight. Marshall asked him, what do you think? Play it straight, he said. Now, the likelihood that the Soviet Union would embrace the Marshall Plan was pretty remote. Part of that, because since those countries had to work together, they had to show a lot of transparency. They had to talk about what their financial realities were. And secondly of all, Stalin was not about to bring them into this Western European United States of Europe, which is what he considered it to be. But it did go out as a plan that was not designated by country, but rather by conditions. And the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov did come to the first meeting in Paris, but eventually he walked out with his Russian delegation. There were countries such as Czechoslovakia and Poland that really wanted to go to those meetings, even after the Soviets walked out. But basically, Stalin told them, "You're not going to go." He did not permit them to go, because there was a sense that maybe the satellite countries would move a bit toward the West. Not that they were going to have to give up communism, that wasn't the idea, but it was more that they were going to become a part of the integration. And that was very threatening to Stalin. And he did not permit it.
He didn't permit it, and that's where we ended up with the Cold War.
Before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, General Marshall explains his support of military aid to Europe.
The only solution that I see is to establish a firm front. And the more resolute the front, the more effective it will be. And the propaganda efforts to convey that this is an aggressive front, of course, are pure propaganda.
Asked how well he thinks the Russians are doing in the Cold War, Marshall replies,
They did pretty well, maybe not so well in the end, but of course they have an immense advantage. I think it's a dangerous advantage and a temporary advantage. In the 12 men decide what to do, and they don't sit here like I am and have 12 others questioning me on why I'm doing it or whether I'll be allowed to do it. They go ahead and do it. I think in the end they destroy themselves. But doing that procedure as to propaganda, as to press, as to public reactions, everything is controlled. Well, that builds up a very powerful line of action. But I think it generally destroys itself. The only thing is sometimes it takes some time to do it.
The initial resistance of the Soviet Union to the plan, and then the lines were drawn, and you had the Cold War. You had Eastern Germany and what we called the Iron Curtain, and Western Europe, which became more prosperous. Almost the results were felt almost immediately. The Marshall Plan funding ended in 1951, and as I've read, Great Britain got 1/4 of the total aid provided under the plan. France got 1/5 of the funds, and then it was divided across Europe. West Germany benefited from the funds. I've also read over the years, too, that, as you mentioned, certain conditions were met. So is there anywhere in the plan where they designated certain industries by country?
Well, there was huge discussions about industry and manufacturing in Germany. You have to remember that during World War II, toward the end of World War II, there came to be the Morgenthau Plan. And the Morgenthau Plan was the idea that you would return Germany to a pre-Bismarck rural population, and you would destroy its industry and its manufacturing. So there's enormous attention paid to what's going to happen to Germany, and the fight between the French and the Marshall planners on the subject of what would become a Germany that would protect France from another invasion over a period of 2 wars. And yet, as the Marshall planners worked and tried to hammer out all of these issues, it became clear that Germany was the linchpin of European economic recovery, that it would truly work against each and every one of those countries if Germany did not recover. So throughout the Marshall Planning years, there's a great deal of emphasis on controlling Germany, but helping Germany recover. And it's that tension that eventually leads to a further split that eventually leads to, say, the Berlin airlift, the closing off of West Berlin. But the question of Germany was key. And so the thing to keep in mind about those countries is that each of them had different economic realities, economic needs, and in the aggregate, it was important to look at where the help was being emphasized based on how much the country had suffered and based on European economic integration, where there would be a strong Western European set of economies. And that just varied from country to country. So therefore, it's so very difficult to paint with a broad brush on that. But let me tell you, Germany was going to recover. And it's really a wonderful story.
I mentioned earlier that George Marshall was surrounded by people from some of America's top companies as part of his group. What role did private industry play in the success of the Marshall Plan once it was implemented?
One of the things that Marshall did after he testified before the Congress about the need for the Marshall Plan, and after he worked with Arthur Vandenberg as a senator on the Republican side to get the needed help that he had to have from the other party that was more isolationist in view, Marshall did this extraordinary thing. He went out across the country and he gave speeches. I always call it the rubber chicken circuit, you know. He talked to Kiwanis clubs, and he talked to women's groups, and he talked to the cotton producers and the tobacco producers and steel industry in Pittsburgh. And in each case, he made the case that Europe on its knees is not going to be beneficial to you. He always also made the point that we are a country that has the capability of doing this, and it's the right thing to do. But the Marshall Plan always had multiple motivations. The idea was that if Europe doesn't recover, you're not going to recover. And you have had a boom economy because of this war, but who is going to buy the excess of your production if Europe is in disarray? So there was that reality for those companies. And Marshall, personally, now it's a very unusual thing for a Secretary of State just to go out across the country and give these stump speeches, and it was absolutely away and outside of Marshall's basic personality. But he almost caught the campaigners' fire, you know, in talking to these companies. But, of course, those companies were also sending products to Europe to close that dollar gap with production that was being paid for by U.S. taxpayer dollars.
So in summing the plan up, there was a financial aid package. There was a process for which the countries that benefited from that financial aid had to participate. And through that participation, there had to be a plan for rebuilding certain industries in certain ways using the aid, and ultimately becoming self-sufficient, trading with the United States and with the rest of the world, and cooperating with each other.
It was important. In the beginning, the United States was benefiting from sending these products to Europe. But in the end, those products, those countries had to be self-sustaining. So their economies had to recover in such a way that it wasn't all about just getting products from the United States. Initially, it was almost artificial. It was artificial, the number of products that were coming from the United States. But the motivation was for those countries to become independent economic entities that could embrace market economies and democratic governments.
Well, that brings us to the results. What were the results of the Marshall Plan?
I think it can be said that those countries began to recover from the devastating effects of that war. And that at the end of 4 years, because one of the things to keep in mind about the Marshall Plan was that it wasn't to last forever. That helped with some of the opposition, because there were people who said, oh yeah, you're just going to pour some more money down the rat hole of Europe and it's never going to end. But the fact was that it did end. And that by the end of the Marshall Plan years, those countries had even begun to have an excess of counterpart funds, because if they gave out low-interest loans, eventually they paid the government back. They began to recover. And so the economies began to become more vigorous. What's interesting is that at the end of those 4 years, the operating agency of the Marshall Plan in Paris and in Washington made the determination with these countries as to what would be done with those counterpart funds. In the case of Great Britain, for example, they were allowed to use that counterpart fund to pay down their debt. But you can sort of think of Britain as a special case because it had been in the war the longest and it suffered terribly. But some of those countries, there were agreements about what would happen with those counterpart funds. In the case of Germany and Austria, they kept those funds separate so that they could be identified still as Marshall Plan funds. Take Austria, for example. Austria nowadays still has a Marshall Fund, which is worth over $3 billion. And it is still giving out low-interest loans in the spirit of the Marshall Plan to some of the Eastern European countries that were once a part of the Soviet Union that need to become more modern through increased, better technology. Low-interest loans to groups of countries that want to get into the EU. That fund is still doing exactly what the Marshall Plan Fund did in that country going back to the time of the post-war. In fact, I think they say that since the Marshall Plan inception, that there have been 208 billion euros, not euros, but shillings, contributed to Marshall Fund projects. So the Marshall Fund is still at work in a country like Austria, and that's where you can really see the multiplier effect of this catalytic agent,
The Marshall Plan brought free trade, capitalism, it bolstered democracy, it led prosperity throughout Western Europe, it rebuilt cities, ended famine, it rebuilt industries and infrastructure. What did the Marshall Plan do for the United States?
Well, I think the biggest thing that it did for the United States is that it extended that relationship between the United States and Western Europe related to business and trade that had always existed, and that would have suffered terribly had that gone away because of the dislocations of war. There's no question that the United States benefited from the Marshall Plan in terms of this ongoing exchange of goods and services between the Western Europe and the United States, which in our own history has always been an important element.
We oftentimes use the word elevator speech when we talk to someone, and it's usually something that you can say in the time it would take to ride an elevator in a small building up. So if you were to talk to a young person, let's just say a middle schooler, who never heard of the Marshall Plan, and you have to give them the elevator speech for the Marshall Plan, how would you explain to a middle schooler what this was and what it meant to them?
I think it's important for any young person to understand that at the end of World War II, life could have gone very differently for these 13 countries of the Marshall Plan. And that because there were people who did some enlightened, visionary thinking, they came up with some ideas that replaced military might with economic might, using tools and concepts that were truly different from what had been done before. And that the United States had been taken kicking and screaming into World War I. And when World War I was over, we went right back and said, ooh, we don't want to do that again. At the end of World War II, the United States made a geopolitical shift. it said, okay, we are going to be a part of this international scene, and we are going to engage in efforts to make life better, not only for ourselves, but for that Western European culture.
Rachel Yarnell Thompson, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
At his home in Pinehurst, North Carolina, with Mrs. Marshall, George Catlett Marshall says goodbye.
For one reason, it was bound to be quite a long time before I would be in condition to resume my duties. And the state of affairs in the world today are too critical to have a long interval without a Secretary of State fully occupied with the job. As for my future plans, they don't go much further than Mrs. Marshall and myself returning to the house to sit down and rest up from this pleasant ordeal, which I might say is probably my final appearance in such matters.
To learn more about the Marshall Plan, the story of George C. Marshall, and our guest today, Rachel Yarnell Thompson, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please let people know by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you can get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook page, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.